Podcast Network Asia.
Welcome to She Talks Peace, a podcast that highlights the role of women peace builders around the world in bringing lasting peace and security to communities. Eavesdrop on their communities and get to know their stories. From the Philippines to Malaysia, from Indonesia to Palestine, from Myanmar to the United States, their dreams and hopes for a world without violence and a world where every woman and girl can be whoever she wants to be. Hosted by Amina Rasul Bernardo, President of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. This is She Talks Peace.
Assalamualaikum. Greetings of peace from Manila. This is Salma Rasul, momentarily taking over the hosting duties for Amina Bernardo. Unfortunately, Amina is stuck at the Dubai airport and she seems to have misplaced her phone. So, and the pressing issue of the day is something that we would like to focus on. So, for everybody listening in, this is your podcast, She Talks Peace, and we would like to focus the discussion on something that has been uh, horrifying millions of viewers who've seen the horrific images blasted over cable news and over regular TV news reports and what we've been seeing on media, what's been happening at the Gaza Strip. Joining me this morning is one of our dynamic research staff who's also helping us in our podcast series. Gab, why don't you greet our audience?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Galvez. You can call me Gab. And I am part of the team actually working on She Talks Peace. So it's nice that from the back end of the podcast series, I'll now be able to talk about the pressing issues that we have now. So, yes.
I thought it would be interesting to get your perspective. For those who do not know Gab's background, she's a recent graduate from Ateneo de Manila University, one of the leading universities here in the Philippines. And her course is on international relations. So, what a perfect topic to focus on. Now, Gab, tell me, October, do you know it's my birth month? October. I just celebrated my birthday last week, but normally it would have been a joyous occasion, right? But what is worrisome and what troubles me is when I turn on the news, I see images of women and children dying and their homes bombarded and destroyed. So, it makes me uh, unhappy and quite upset that what's happening in the world. We're supposed to be building peace, crossing bridges, getting people uh, united to focus on issues like climate change, environmental degradation, and then we see this terrible imagery coming in from the Middle East. Um, Gab, from your research on what's been happening in the past month, starting October 7, right? What's behind this conflict between the government of Israel and Hamas?
Um, so actually, just to bring a little bit of context, as an international relations major, it might be surprising, but in our course, um, in my 4 years, we don't actually delve deeper much into the history of these kinds of conflicts, which, as I learned as I progressed through my senior years, I felt now we should talk about. And it's kind of worrisome because, for example, when the news blew out about the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, the initial perspective of people watching is actually, oh my gosh, who bombed who? And the person who, the group who bombed this particular country will be labeled, of course, and scorned automatically without knowing, for example, the underlying nuances that comes with the attack and also the long-standing issues with that. And when I looked into it, I realized that I didn't know much about what's been happening in Israel, and we haven't been taught about it, which is actually very very concerning because that's already me who is a student who's supposed to be knowledgeable about these things. And what's also worrying is, of course, for example, my family who knows much less about, for example, global affairs, they will, for example, develop these kinds of conjectures without researching or without really understanding what's been happening. So
From the timeline, right? October 7, Hamas Hamas has been, known as to be one of the very extremist groups, right? Highly polarized, and most countries have labeled them as a terrorist group because they really use violence to push for, or publicize what their advocacies are. Uh, right or wrong, still, the way they use violence is not humane. That's being very civil about it, right? But October 7, they struck around 22 sites, I think, in Israel. Normally, from what I recall, the skirmishes would often be isolated. Not It would not go deeper into Israeli territory. But this time around, Tel Aviv and other outlying areas were struck. So, of the 22 attacks, how many there were around? How many were casualties? Can you recall?
I think around 200 people were killed and almost like more than 1,000 people were injured in the initial attack. Yeah.
But the problem was, Israel immediately countered, right? And again, heavily struck, uh, drop bombs. And unfortunately, most of the victims were civilians. So we see images of women and children, both from Palestine and from Israel, suffering as casualties of this conflict. And yet, uh, although there have been some countries who've been trying to de-escalate tension, still the announcement of the government of Israel that they wanted the immediate evacuation of what, over a million civilians from the Gaza Strip. uh, if you Google and do online research, the Gaza Strip has been, uh, some news reporters term it as an open air prison because of the, you know uh, extremely bad living conditions of people located in the strip, like for 140 square kilometers, right? And there are how many millions of civilians? It's really densely populated. So right now, after October 7, there have been countermeasures undertaken by the government of Israel. And would you know that, I got Viber messages, group chats talking about what's happening in Gaza. And would you believe that there has been a wide protest against what's happening and what's uh, the negative impact on the civilian communities. Even in Harvard University, there was a huge protest against what's happening in Palestine. I don't know if you've read about it, but student organizations and other organizations gathered in a wide protest march calling for sobriety in the handling of the conflict in the Gaza Strip. Your group, what have they been? I mean, for your international relations block, what have what are their reactions? For instance, when I came back from Aceh, the young students, young professionals there were so upset with what has been happening and how it has affected the civilian population. In fact, when you go, we were, roaming the streets of Aceh. We see young people uh, campaigning, getting donations because they wanted to uh, get funds to buy relief supplies that they hope would be shipped to Gaza for the civilian community. Do you think there's a similar reaction among young Filipinos here?
Actually, certainly, because even my conversations with fellow international relations major, even those of the younger age group, they were really horrified and deeply concerned about what's happening. Because for us, there are no winners in war. Like, as long as there are war, everyone's victims, and it's very hard to see the any good effect that it will have. And actually, M- I interned I interned in New York in a BIPOC community youth movement in New York a few years back, and they are actually um, gathering funds to ship it or to at least support organizations in Israel or Palestine that help the civilians or the victims on the ground. And that's very interesting because, for example, that youth organization is focused on gun violence, but we are coming here together to help other communities from other states, from other countries with other issues as well. And I also see that the other students, for example, because they don't have much reach yet, what they're doing is they're writing about it. So which I think is very important. Like what we're doing here in She Talks Piece, we're trying to talk about it to enhance dialogue so that more people be will know what's happening. And that's our form of tribute. And I think with the younger generation, that's also how they kind of participate. So, yes. And I see that there's been many protests actually of youth based organizations and even like not just in the Philippines, but for example, in the Middle East, like I saw groups of youth in Tunisia, in Egypt, for example, Lebanon, even in Burkina Faso, Nigeria. So those are very interesting to see also.
Yeah, but our own Philippine government issued a statement. I mean, President Marcos, uh, right now is in Riyadh, right, for the ASEAN GCC summit. GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is mostly made up of Middle East states. And these are two regional blocks, right? Both leaders from coming from both regional blocks condemned the escalation of violence in Gaza. Secondly, they called for de-escalation, sobriety, and that a focus should be made on how to alleviate the suffering of the civilians, because like it or not, the first among the first casualties are non-combatants, children and women and old people. So the groups have been calling for dialing down the sentiment and the anger and knee-jerk reactions against countering violence with violence, because nothing would wouldn't bear any fruit, right? For if you're looking how to settle this conflict, it cannot be attained by use of violent force. Rather, it ought to be done by dialogue, right? And they came out with a statement, I think, a couple of hours ago, exactly asking government of Israel to exercise sobriety and to temper its measures against Hamas, and to make sure that whatever use of force, it shouldn't be unnecessarily deployed in areas where they're densely populated by civilians. So what is alarming, at least for us Filipinos, and mostly for those belonging to Southeast Asia, we have large overseas workers in the Middle East, and any unrest would, of course, destabilize the political climate in the region. And what's worrisome is we've heard reports that, in fact, it was quite has been trending in social media, that the nurse who was killed because she was taking care of a Jewish patient. And then again, we see reports of very young Jewish people and very young Palestinians taking arms and, killing civilians. Why is this? Why has this come to be? I mean, we used to be more uh, circumspect in our actions, right? But considering the current conditions in the Gaza Strip, where poverty, I think, is quite prevalent. In fact, the poverty index there, it has been in the extremes for the past 2 decades already, or more than 2 decades, since the 1970s. It has been slowly been dwindling to and causing no misery to most of the communities located in the Gaza Strip. So if you look at it again, it's a question of not only because we're familiar with the term, right? Historic injustice and land. Who has the right to occupy? This has been addressed by the United Nations, but no lasting solution has been reached since the 1967. So I'm not sure if in your studies while you were at the Ateneo, or even when you were in high school, whether it's part of your world history, what's been happening in the Middle East.
Well, unfortunately, the in Ateneo, there are no specific courses that talk about, for example, what's happening or what has been happening for a few decades now, ever since the late 90s. And I think with how I'm telling that, it's very important that we actually forward these kind of education, because I think it has come up also with how I work with, for example, PCID, with the organization, that even the stories of BARM, of Bangsamoro, isn't as widely talked about, or isn't part of the curricula in the Philippines. And that is something that we should endeavor to promote further. And now that I'm, for example, working, it delivers kind of lesser understanding of what's happening. And I think we really need to talk about this further.
Gab, since you're in your late teens and early 20s, right? How do you think? Why do you think the young Palestinians and the young Jews are how do you say this, are motivated to use violence in this case. What makes them take arms, as we've seen various reports, and media coverages showing very young civilians, taking arms. What do you think is enters into their psyche? What makes them susceptible to doing violence against their fellow? I mean, they all live in the same community, right?
Yes. So, I mean, just the fact that they are, for example, compelled, or they think that they need to like resort to violence, means that, I believe, for example, they think that there's not, nothing else that can be done aside from using violence. So, for example, it may be a belief that they have, or it's a frustration of not being heard, that they have exhausted other means, that they think, must I use violence to um, forward my the issues, my rights, or what I'm fighting for. This is not to say that violence is good. Of course, we are not saying that. But it also brings into consideration, when we look into the issue, that what makes it possible that even the youth, with so much ahead, and of course with so much feeling, would believe that they really need to resort to violence. So yes.
Do you think, with the situation happening in Gaza, and then here in our region, we also have uh, problems faced in Myanmar and southern Thailand, right? And here in our area, the conflict that's that is usually reported in Mindanao, although there has been relatively, I mean, peace and order, the situation has relatively stabilized. But again, because of the heated rivalry this coming barangay elections, again, we see pockets of violence, or, conflict appearing in certain spots. But for a person as young as you, uh, how do you what how does the future look like to you? I mean, if you see these uh, images of war, of damaged buildings, and bodies thrown over the rubble in the Middle East, and then you also hear reports of violence in southern Thailand, and areas in the Philippines. Do you th- are How do you view this? Does it make you pessimistic, or you still have optimism in so far as your future uh, is like?
Actually, two things. So, initially, of course, there's a big worry, a big concern on what even the future holds, because of course, we don't also forget that just a year ago, there's the Russia and Ukraine, like, conflict, and then now this is happening also, and we know that there are many things stirring in other places, for example, in the world, not even far from us. And when I talk about it with, for example, with my um with youth of my generation, we really are concerned that what is there to look forward to? Some people are asking that, really, like, what is there to look forward to? Should we even fight this hard, work this hard, if we're not sure that the future that is waiting for us is peaceful, or if there even is a future waiting for us, which is very, very concerning, because, like, to see the youth even much younger than me think like that, it's very concerning. But also at the same time, this, of course, especially is with people from my circle, for example, in the political science majors, the international relations majors. The second thing is it's also what compels us to work harder, to fight harder, just so these concerns of the younger generation and even the generation of ours won't be materialized, even in the small pockets of, for example, resistance or action that can be done. So I think it goes both ways. So there's concern, but also it kind of challenges us and empowers us to act.
Yeah, I saw a statement made by the Chinese government. Surprise, surprise. They were condemning the violence happening in Gaza, but no mention about, the occupation and the move by they condemned the government of Israel for forcibly evacuating the million or so occupants, residents of the Gaza Strip. And I was thinking, what about the West Philippine Sea? and and the way they're denying our fishermen uh, the opportunity to fish in our own territorial waters. So if you look at these reports, right, it's kind of depressing. So how do young people uh, attain or still retain their motivation, as they, continuously see every day there's always some uh, depressing news uh, of conflict uh, here in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, and then what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening right now in the Middle East, in Gaza.
I think ultimately because we know that for um for example, for peace to be promoted, for something to happen, the change really needs to also start from like the people, from us. And while, for example, we're scared of the horrors or the implications of what we're seeing, um what we're hearing, there's nothing really better than to try to help. And for example, I think this also speaks to how most or some of us are called to be service oriented as well, because for like I really believe that if we want to see the change, if we want to see peace, and we want for that peace to continue, it's really an active action or effort from the people. And if we just try to, if we just step back, or if we just succumb to the threats or the concerns that we have even as youth, then I think the concerns we have then might materialize. So that's why we really have to think towards acting and not just staying where we are.
Yesterday I was part of a panel looking at women, peace, and security, and how the key concepts in the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 can be cascaded down to the community. The forum was attended by community leaders here in Metro Manila and the National Capital Region. So one of the questions posed to us was, what can community leaders do, for instance, to embed this concept of peace and to make that as a priority goal for all communities. Uh, Most of the attendees were women, although there was a maybe 20% male. And most of the women were asking, what can women in the community do? For instance, what can women here in the Philippines do to help their sisters suffering in Gaza or in Myanmar or in Ukraine, aside from raising their voices opposing unnecessary violence deployed by military forces, right? What else can they do? What do you think can be done?
Okay. So, yeah, of course. I think aside from just opposing, because I think it also is similar to how we see these statements. And funnily enough, in international relations, that's very much a common like path, making these statements to um, support or deny or say something about the specific issues. But of course, community level with women or with youth, I think what's important is mobilizing, really working together to, for example, help the communities going on the ground or seeking to hear what's happening or actively organizing programs to spearhead these dialogues. So I think that's one step ahead from just saying something um, to declare words with statements, but actively mobilizing to gather, for example, key stakeholders or getting resources so that it can be received by those who really need it, and even empowering the voices of those who think they're not being heard. Because in the first place, also, it's not just trying to heal what's been, for example, um, what's been destroyed, but also making an effort to prevent further damage being done or for this to be happening. And I think communities work well doing that, not just in the front level and but also in the back level.
What's interesting are the reports of interviews done with uh, the civilians, right? There was one casualty, I think, was a human rights advocate, a Jewish human rights advocate, and the family. I forget the name, but I think if you Google it, the family said that you shouldn't use the loss of of their family member as a justification to escalate violence against Palestinians. So there's a certain divide, right, between what governments uh, policies are in this case in the conflict in Gaza, and what the civilian populations feel. Because if you hear and read the comments and the sentiment shared by the average Jew, the Palestinians in Gaza, they're saying that we don't hate the Jewish people. The Jewish people say we don't hate the Palestinians because I mean they had learned to coexist, but the adverse policies taken by the government of Israel in further the hard line stance it has against as it pursues Hamas, it has a very, very adverse impact on civilian populations. And this is what struck me most because most of the protesters in any of the mass demonstrations that has been occurring across the world, most of them are also Jewish, uh, the Jewish citizens, and they also point to the fact that um, the Palestinians also deserve their place, and Hamas is not Palestine, and Palestine is not Hamas. So there should be a differentiation. Unfortunately, the bullet and the bomb does not recognize it. The minute it's the bomb is dropped or the minute the bullet leaves the barrel of the gun, it strikes any person regardless of identity, right? So again, this use of force. And what's worrisome is uh, high powered firearms have been used, and the firepower can hurt not just a single civilian, but can actually kill and mutilate more than one. Okay, Gab, we've heard you've shared your views on what young Filipinos feel about what's happening in Gaza. Now, if you were given the opportunity to speak to your classmates, your batchmates, or members of your neighborhood, right? What would you tell them? Uh, you know, with respect to getting their cooperation, maybe, or support for any plans you may have to address uh, what's been happening in Gaza? Or is this something that's not a priority issue to your mind of young Filipinos like yourself?
I think it's very, very much relevant. And actually, now more than ever, we need to act, even if these events are not directly happening in the country. And if I will be asked to speak to our generation, one thing I would say is that we need to look beyond what's happening in, for example, our own spaces, and look at what's happening in the world, and seeing how we are also in the responsibility to try and contribute to peace, not just in the Philippines, but also in the world. And I think one thing that I also want to say is that we really need to make an effort to know more about what's happening. Because if there's one thing I've noticed, if it's not happening in the Philippines, the chance that the people or our youth will know about it is very, very, very limited. That's why there's really a challenge to urge the youth, urge our generation to look beyond, for example, what we see on our phones, what we see on social media, but try to research and try to look at the nuances of these conflicts, of the history of these actions, and also try in our small initiatives to contribute, if not even the direct donations or contributions, but talking about it, because talking about it does something. And yeah,
Why do you think it's relevant? Because the question of relevance, you already mentioned it, right? I mean, a normal Filipino teenager would not care, right? Especially if neither of his parents are deployed in the Middle East for work. So, why should they care? That's the question. Why should they care about what's happening in Gaza, in Ukraine?
why should they care? Well, for the very simple purpose that it's also just happening to fellow humans, to people. And we don't really need to make a justification that we should be related, um, very tightly linked for us to care about what's happening outside our world. Just the simple fact that we're um, people as well. It's also people, it's also youth, it's also children, mothers, women, citizens who are being affected by conflict. You don't need to directly be affected by it to care. And especially if us with the privilege to be at peace or be at home when other people don't have that liberty. Other people are being bombed right now and they don't have the choice of running or going somewhere else. And just that power that we have, privilege that we have, is a responsibility of us to try to make an effort so that other people will have it too, because it's of course a right, and peace should be global.
Well said, Gab. You know, after COVID, I mean, the first 2 years, right? I would have thought, to my mind, people would be more uh, sympathetic, more empathic because of what has happened to us and the difficulty we all the whole world faced with the pandemic. I thought, that our emotions, our selfishness has, diminished, and that we learn to be more caring of one another, because what happens to us, we saw during at the height of COVID, right? What happens to another greatly impacts our lives. So I thought, continue in the continuum, we would have learned from what we've experienced. And yet, what's happening in Gaza, it seems the lessons may not have been heeded by, again, mostly by the policymakers, right? By governments uh, who have been taking a very harsh stance using deployment of military forces and technology aided armaments. So, again, I share with you what I learned and what we discussed yesterday in that forum on women in peace building. And one the last question asked of all of us members of the panel was, what is your advice, or what should be something that the audience or the participants in that forum should take away? And my first answer was, uh, to learn to be civil. Have you noticed that there seems to be a lack of civility? As technology progresses, uh, the sense of civility of being human seems to have been lost. You see harsh words posted online. There's no more censorship of hurtful words that they uh, blast against, people they don't even really know, just because they didn't like what was posted, or that the photos of taken by a certain individual, which he or she shared online, is something that they did not agree with. But instead of saying that, I disagree with what you're saying, they criticize and curse, and some of the hurtful words have caused uh, emotional hurt, emotional damage. And I think even the psyche of the people posting, that's why there have been high incidences of bullying, right? That has caused what? That has led to suicide, and people, doing harm to themselves. So my first word was, you have to learn to be civil to one another. Second is, be kind. You have to be kind to one another. And with kindness comes tolerance. I mean, we are not made in the same mode. We differ from one another, but we should celebrate our differences, because that makes life more interesting and engaging. So that was what we shared, and then most of the participants agreed, because they themselves find that intolerance, more often than not, is the cause of conflict. What do you think, Gab? Is this also true in your generation?
Yes, actually, very interestingly enough, we might be familiar with the word cancel culture, things like that, and that's actually very very um like prevalent in our youth. Like one, for example, mistake that one person does, in a minute they'll be cancelled, and then there's not much room for error or understanding or delving deeper into what's happening. And sometimes when these things happen, like people cancel this figure, and then moments later, maybe a week or so, they see that actually the news that they found out about the figure is wrong. And I think, and if we look at it, then you won't really get to go back and undo, for example, the hurtful words that you have committed, you have done. And of course, the effect also that has on the person that you have canceled, for example, also presents a different like point. And if I may relate that to what's happening, for example, for example, these lack of support, this lack of understanding, the stance that we make, it really affects multitudes to the people who are affected by the conflict of the war. And that's just us in our split second decision, or the government's split second decision of helping or not, of saying this word or not. And I think that in the future, for in the future especially, what we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen is to be more understanding, like you said, attorney, to be more civil, and to err really on this perspective of peace and inclusivity, so that don't have these we don't make these actions that really terribly impact people.
Yeah. And this is the last quarter of the year. This, as you know, the Philippines, we celebrate the holidays as early as September. And uh, the holidays, Christmas, New Year, is supposed to be a celebration and a prayer for peace for the whole world. So as we close our episode for today, I would like all our audience listening to the podcast She Talks Peace, if you could say a little prayer for all those who are in the Gaza Strip, both Palestinians and Jews, uh, for they are suffering. There have been Israeli citizens, Jewish citizens who've been trapped and are unable to escape from the Gaza Strip because of the measures taken by Hamas, and because of the extreme hard line position taken by the Israeli government. The continuous bombardment of the Gaza Strip has also uh, impacted civilian communities. So there has been escalation of deaths and casualties among Palestinians. So I would like to request everybody if we could share a minute and pray that peace may prevail and that wise heads can intervene and de escalate the tension that's occurring in the Middle East, so that as we look towards 2024, we attain some stability in the region. So, Gab, um, much as I would like to end the episode, I hope that we look for uh, tomorrow's news to report something positive, right? That cooler heads have prevailed, and that the use of force uh, should be the last resort, if ever, and that they should both sides, Hamas and the Israeli government, should come to the table to negotiate and talk. Although an extreme policy of not negotiating with terrorists, but still, because of the numbers of casualties among civilians, mostly women and children, I think this is something that we all should worry about and should be, should consider as a pressing issue that should concern everybody. So, Gab, if you want to say your farewell for as we close this episode.
So again, just the final words is we don't have to experience these to really care, and especially the youth, we should try to know more, act more, to help what we can and elevate the dialogue about these issues. And of course, even for the government, authorities, I think I really compel that we act with compassion, to think about that bottom line. Who's affected in this? It's the civilians, it's innocent people, lives at stake also. So thank you so much for inviting me at She Talks Peace, and I hope you enjoy the episode, and see you next week.
And this is Salma Rasul, taking the stead of Amina Rasul Bernardo, wishing everybody a prayerful day, and hopeful that tomorrow would yield a better future for our brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip. So, uh, folks, do listen to our future episodes of She Talks Peace. And from the Philippines, a good day to all. Goodbye.
Bye.
She Talks Peace is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Network Asia and Podmetrics, the easiest way to monetize your podcast. For more information, check out their website at podcastnetwork.asia and podmetrics.co.
The views and opinions expressed by the podcast creators, hosts, and guests do not necessarily reflect the official policy and position of Podcast Network Asia, the hosts of the program, or other programs of the network. Any content provided by the people on the podcast are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.